All right, welcome everybody to the fourth Peace Dialogue Roundtable. We really are excited to engage in today's discussion today. We have Glenn Diesen, a very accomplished, prolific author, writer, analyst, who's joined us today. I think everybody here has been familiar in varying degrees with Glenn's amazing work over the past years. Very soon, Alex Krainer will also be joining us. There's a lot of very, very interesting not anomalies, I should say singularities. It's a very high dense period of world history. We're coming into the elections very shortly in the United States. Additionally, we have the Shanghai Cooperation Summit that just ended. Some very interesting discussions, potentials have been actualized in this domain. The BRICS Summit in Kazan, long awaited, is also approaching very, very quickly. And we're seeing more discussion around what would be a new viable economic security architecture for the world outside of the collapsing transatlantic architecture, which has been sitting on a barrel full of fallacies and self-contradictions for a long time and is now in a very late stage of rot and self-destruction. So do we have it within us here in the Western world to get our collective heads out of our asses in order to recognize what humanity actually needs to survive? Or are we going to keep on holding on to certain delusions that have created this crisis in the first place? So that's the big question. That's what we're fueling in a lot of these discussions and dialogues every couple of weeks. So again, I'm very curious. I'm going to take a step back, listen to Glenn Diesen afterwards. We're going to have Alex Krainer do some formal remarks. And like usual, I ask people to leave their names in the chat box if you'd like to ask a question or pose a thought that you'd like to share, or put your little digital hand up. Ed is here too as well, who's going to be moderating with me. And with that, I'll leave it over to Glenn Diesen.
Thank you so much. Yes, I was asked to speak a bit about world order in the context of the Ukraine war, and it's very much also related to I think the meeting we now see with the SCO as well as the BRICS upcoming BRICS meeting now in Kazan. It's all very related to this in terms of a shifting world order. So my main argument has been that the Ukraine war is a symptom of a changing world order, the reason why we have this war to begin with, but it's also a war which is further intensifying this transition into multipolarity because it's effectively a symbol of the transition we're going through, very destructive transition away from unipolarity. So I put this collapse of the US-led international order, especially the unipolar world order after the Cold War, to the wider phenomenon of world order, which is the rules we have in the international system of how states should behave. But it's also, of course, reference to the international distribution of power and the rules that legitimize it. So this is usually what we refer to when we speak of world order. And I much like Kissinger built on his ideas that the modern world order can be seen to have been been based on the Westphalian system. That is the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30-year war in Europe. Now, what makes this world order, or the foundation of the modern world order, unique is that it is based on multipolarity and distinctive values. As its predecessor, when you had a Holy Roman Empire, it was based around hegemony, one center of power, and these rules were then legitimized by universal rules, so which allowed, under the ideas of the Catholic Church to rule over all the Europeans. Now, so this is the system we had since the balance, multipolar world order based on a balance of power. But let's be honest, in 1648, the different poles were mostly European. So the way we divided the world based on who should be sovereign and who should have limited or no sovereignty was more or less based on who were European or not. And throughout history, we always had some efforts to overcome the subsequent international anarchy as a result of having not having a hegemony, as some countries have aspired to overcome the international anarchy by establishing global dominance. So the international anarchy then is simply the reference to the security competition, because if you have many centers of power, it effectively becomes a system of anarchy, not necessarily have to be chaos, but simply that there's no one source of power. Now, after the Cold War, the United States was at a crossroads. It had effectively two different world order it could pursue. It could either pursue this a multipolar system in accordance with the former centuries of world order, or it could pursue a more ambitious objective, which was to overcome the entire world order defined by many centers of power. Now, I always make the point that I think many people in the United States um, had good intentions when they desired to pursue hegemony, because global primacy, or seeking global dominance, it of course is very easy to point out why it would fail, or why it can be very destructive. But the main goal, I think, obviously was to overcome the international anarchy in the international system. That is, if there's one center of power, there wouldn't anymore be a rivalry between the major powers, as the US security strategy of 2002 suggested, because no state or even group of states could even aspire to challenge the US. And also, not just having this unipolar distribution of power, but we also saw that the United States believed that if they dominated the global primacy, they could also elevate the role of liberal democratic values. So these were the arguments for. As we remember from the 90s, there was also strong arguments why it would not work. And this was essentially, it would be very difficult to preserve dominance. It would depend on holding down other rising powers. Over time, the United States would exhaust its resources, and other centers of powers would begin to collectively balance the United States. And my argument is 30 years later, I think that social experiment has been run, and we see the consequence. That is, with the BRICS meeting now, we do see that many centers of power around the world are balancing the US. Even friends and allies of the United States would like a multipolar system in which they're pursuing multi-vector foreign policy, where they have many foreign connections to different poles of power in order not to be excessively reliant on any one state or region. And furthermore, so not only is the world balancing the United States or its hegemonic ambitions, but we're also seeing the US, as predicted, has exhausted itself. When you run an empire over time, it becomes imperial overstretch in terms of strategic commitments become greater than what can be sustained. So we see the national debt level has gone through the roof, economic inequalities, social fragmentations, political polarization across the board. Things obviously aren't becoming better and better. It's as simply as overplayed its hand. And also, I think there was some wrong assumptions about how the unipolar system would work. The idea was, again, benign. I think that the way the US led the Western world after World War II, that this would put in a global format. But of course, the Cold War was a very unique system. That is, the large military confrontation, it demanded a lot of economic cooperation between the capitalist states. That is, a lot of economic statecraft and economic rivalry was mitigated exactly because there was a higher priority of the Soviet challenge. Furthermore, the main adversaries of the United States were communist countries, largely decoupled from international markets. Today, you see both China and Russia being quite well versed in economic statecraft, and also we see increasingly American allies also pursuing more economic independence, in which it could be limited by the United States. So overall, we see that the system isn't working anymore. Now, I often point out that the foundation of economic dominance has been economic. I often point back to the same three pillars of the American system, which allowed the US to be autonomous from Britain, is also the three pillars which it based its dominance on. That is, the American system pursued a manufacturing base, which is the technological sovereignty, physical connectivity, that is with roads and ports, and later railroad. And the third pillar has been the financial instruments, which was back then a national bank. Now, this became the same source of hegemony for the United States, then growingly after the World War II and then the Cold War. So dominating the main technologies, being at the top end of global value chains, controlling the world's maritime corridors, the banks, payment trade currency, payment systems, and yeah, everything from commodity exchanges, insurances. And this is what hegemony has been based on to a large extent. So if you want to see how hegemony is challenged, I think it's mostly in the economic sphere. And this is why China is seen as challenging all of these three areas. Now, the reason why China and Russia is because, in contrary to our narratives, both the Chinese and Russians have considered themselves to be balanced after the Cold War, for good reasons. In Europe, we tried to create Europe without Russia, which unavoidably became a Europe against Russia, as the largest country on the continent is the only country that's not part of Europe. So we deprive it of any institutional influence, effectively compelling it to use hard power in order to defend its interest, which has manifested itself, of course, in this horrible war. And it's also worth noting we actually had treaties with the Russians, especially the 1990 Charter of Paris for a new Europe. So we had the systems in place for multipolar world order, which we rejected in favor of unipolarity, which manifested itself, as you know, in NATO expansion. So again, it almost feels redundant to explain why expanding a military bloc closer and closer to the Russian border was not a good recipe for stability and peace. But the Chinese as well felt that they were continued to be contained, but they slowly outgrew the US-led economic system. And that's why we see the Russians as well as the Chinese essentially following the same American system. Obviously, the Chinese much more powerful, but with the Chinese, they pursue this China 2025, taking leading technologies. So the first pillar, the Russians less capabilities, but nonetheless and working towards technological sovereignty, especially in terms of its digital ecosystem. The Chinese then pursued the physical connectivity with the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia has a similar international north-south corridor as well as Arctic corridor. So they have their own similar systems. And then, of course, the third pillar, which gets most of the attention, which is the efforts by the Chinese, Russians, as well as other countries around the world to find an alternative financial system that is de-dollarize, use their own currencies, develop new payment systems, which will probably be one of the big things that we'll talk about in Kazan. The grain corridor. We're going to see more commodity exchanges. There's a lot of things they want to build on, and indeed they see that the unipolar economic system is collapsing. So the rest of the world is actually looking for alternatives because they do not. They see the way the United States has tried to push back on Chinese technological development, something that disrupts supply chains around the world, and this caused a lot of disruption. So same as stealing the Russian sovereign funds, it's a lot of things we didn't think was possible in the past, which is now becoming more and more common. So we tend to use new words as reshore, friendshore, de-risk, but all of this is implying that it's a transition towards more neo-mercantilism. And this is quite predictable. We see that when there's a huge concentration of power in a hegemon, there's an incentive to produce trust also. If referred as a liberal international economic system, when that hegemon declines and uses its administrative control over an international economy to prevent the rise of other centers of power, we see the collapse or falling into neo-mercantilist behavior. So I think that this is why much of the world is looking for alternatives. It's not, I wouldn't define it as anti-American. I would see it as anti-hegemonic. I think even China wouldn't want to see, for example, a collapse in the dollar. They would like to see a more moderated American position, as many have an interest in the stability of the United States. It's simply this pushback against American hegemony. Now, and I think that this is what BRICS represents to many countries. It's a multipolar system that is it has many centers of power, and this also allows a lot of countries to pursue multi-vector foreign policy. So, if one wants to see why the Saudis or Turks or well, any of the countries now looking to join BRICS, why they want to join, it's not that they want to join a Chinese alliance instead of an American alliance. No, they want to go away from a unipolar system to a multipolar system, because in a multipolar system, they can diversify their economic connectivity. They can have many trade partners, which means they can also have, they're less vulnerable for economic coercion. They will have more political autonomy. And yeah, this is what they're pursuing. If it was a hegemonic system where the Chinese would attempt to dictate everything, most likely it would lose a lot of its appeal, which is why it's also positive that other large countries are joining BRICS, because it will make it less less likely that the Chinese can dominate this bloc. So it represents therefore a much flatter international distribution of power. And indeed, in a multipolar world order with many centers of power in terms of economics, there's always an interest in pursuing a multi-vector foreign policy. But while most of the world is pursuing this path, we see the exact opposite from the Europeans. And this is quite fascinating, because I I see this as irrational, because if the Europeans would like to remain relevant in the world, they would surely want to have many centers of connect themselves to many centers of power, uh, instead of instead of only linking themselves to one. Because in a multipolar system, this behavior is punished because it is irrational. So, for example, we see now the Europeans cutting themselves off from Russia. The Germans are blaming Russia for cutting themselves off, but that's well factually wrong. It was them who cut themselves off from Russia, and being asked to cut ourselves off from China, Iran, and overall, the main problem is Europe becomes less prosperous. It becomes excessively dependent on the United States, a very asymmetrical partnership. And for this reason, Europe also becomes less and less relevant. And this is all being done at a point in history when the United States has to also adjust to multipolarity, which means its focus and resources will be shifting more towards Asia. So while the United States has less to offer Europe, it will demand more economic loyalties, political obedience, and Europeans, I think, are doing this out of instinct. The world seems more unsafe. When the world is unsafe, we have a tendency to retreat under US protection. And again, while it's a good idea to be a friend and ally of the United States, this excessive dependence, I think, is yeah, leaving Europe very, very vulnerable, and yeah, undermining its own interest at this point in time. So yes, for anyone who's interested in this book, it does address the economic ideas, and half the book is actually about the Ukraine war, even though I haven't talked much about it. But this is yeah, in general, the I also outlined why the unipolar world order created the Ukraine war. Um, yeah, to the point that also American leaders recognized that the Russians saw little opportunity or little alternatives. If they didn't want NATO to establish themselves in Ukraine on the border of Russia, this was seen as unfortunate action they had to take. Again, not a attempt to legitimize or support or anything. Just if you read the writings of William Burns, Jack Matlock, George Kennan, this was predictable, and yeah, that was my main point. But also that because the war has gone so bad in Ukraine, I think it's also not just discrediting NATO, but it's also encouraging the rest of the world to diversify away from the West. And I think this is what we have been seeing. That is, the rest of the world is not necessarily supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but they're also not supporting NATO's proxy war against Russia, the effort to break the Russians. And for this reason, we see now this huge push towards diversification. So yes, thank you very much for your attention. I'll just leave it there.
No, that was excellent. Thank you, Glenn. Do you have time to stay on for any of the Q&A, or I know you have to leave for a family emergency as well? So
Yeah, I have 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
Sorry about this. I really
No, all's
apologize.
good. How about this? How about we allow one question before we go to Alex Krainer for Glenn, who has to run in 4 minutes. So, does anybody have a pressing question for Glenn before we go to Alex? All right, I got one question, Glenn. Oh, I see Ed's lips are moving, but I don't hear anything because his mute is on. Ed, you have
Well,
to.
are they trying to depopulate the entire? I mean, is there an agenda to populate the Earth? But Matthew, please ask your question. I'm sure it's better than mine. Uh,
I
can
don't
you
know.
hear me?
Okay, yeah, Nathan, it's fine. We heard you. Glenn, do you want to just address that, or just simply let it sit?
So who's attempting to depopulate the Earth?
The question
Oh,
was asking: is there a intention for reducing the world population behind a lot of these machinations that you went through? I guess is what the questioner was asking.
Oh, I'm not sure about any efforts to depopulate the world, but I think that the war in Ukraine has become defined by as a war of attrition, in which if you present Russia with a proposition or well, what Russia considers a threat to its existence, which is NATO and Ukraine, and you refuse to negotiate, you sabotage the only possible avenues to peace, the Minsk agreement, and then the Istanbul negotiations, then the only outcome is a war of attrition. When you won't even refuse to sit down and have diplomacy with the other side. Now, in a war of attrition, it's effectively two sides just bleeding each other out until one is completely emptied. And I think this is the huge tragedy of the Ukraine war. There were so many paths to peace, indeed, as was recognized by the Ukrainians, the mediators in Istanbul, and all sides effectively was that both the Russians and the Ukrainians really wanted a deal, and instead we have now a war of attrition. So I see, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dying, as well as many young Russian men. Um, the economy being destroyed, losing vital territory required to survive its main industries. It's yeah, the entire nation is being destroyed. It's a massive tragedy. This could have been avoided very easily. And well, to quote Zelensky himself in March of 2022, as he was interviewed by The Economist, he actually said that while they were close to a deal with the Russians in which they would restore their neutrality and the Russians would pull out, Zelensky said, if we get there's many countries in the West who would like us to fight Russia in a long war, so we can exhaust the Russians, even if this means the demise of Ukraine as a country. This is Zelensky's own words, so I would recommend people watch this to understand what actually happened and why we're actually in this war, which is depopulating Ukraine, at least. I'm not sure about the wider world, but yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Sorry, thank you, Glenn. Now,
Glenn, yeah.
as I mentioned, we only had time for that one question before
Yeah.
we shift gears to Alex. Ed, did you want to say a quick word before we move to Alex?
No, it's okay. I don't want to hold Glenn, and I hope we will get him back also next time when we talk about U.S. elections. Glenn.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to come back anytime, and I really apologize for having to run so quickly. But yeah, thanks again. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Glenn.
Okay.
All right, Alex Krainer is a
Hi.
geoeconomic analyst, somebody who's been a friend and ally for a long time. Alex, I'm really happy that you're here to join us and share your insights. Glenn set the stage pretty nicely for the economic considerations that I know you have in abundance, as well as a lot of other things. So, Alex, it is all yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that the economic considerations are always the ones that are leading the system of incentives. And part of the objectives of my research over the year has been to try to understand where it's all coming from. So that's what my remarks are going to be focused on. So in his remarks to the United Nations General Assembly in October 2014, Noam Chomsky opened with the statement that many of the world's problems are so intractable that it is hard to think of ways even to take steps towards mitigating them. I'm sorry, Zoom is asking me what language I'm speaking in, so I had to cancel it. Sorry about the distraction. So since Noam Chomsky's speech, circumstances have only deteriorated further. And in addition to the festering social, political, and economic crisis plaguing the developed world, we find ourselves inexorably sliding towards another world war. All this seems unnecessary and preventable, yet in spite of the fact that an overwhelming majority of people around the world abhor these developments, it seems oddly difficult for us to change course. So why are our economies chronically in crisis? Why are the poverty rates rising? Why do we have people sleeping in the streets? Because modern industrial economies are extraordinarily productive. So how come we aren't concerned about overabundance or anxious about how to properly enjoy all the blessings? Furthermore, given that all the people around the world detest war, where does this state of permanent warfare come from? Is it from the democratic will of the people? Clearly not. Since ordinary people almost always vote for anti-war candidates, Chomsky was right. We really are up against intractable problems. To mitigate them, we need to explore where they originate from. To do that, we must start with the broadest possible context within which the otherwise perplexing day-to-day events are unfolding. In his speech to the World Economic Forum gathering in Davos in May 2021, George Soros offered an important clue. He said that the world is increasingly engaged in a struggle between two systems of governance. He contrasted the two systems as the open societies versus closed societies. The same view has been affirmed by other Western officials, including the former US ambassador to NATO, Kurt Walker. Walker characterized the conflict as the one between democracies and autocratic regimes or dictatorships. However, in praising liberal democracies and demonizing dictatorships, people like Walker and Soros misrepresent the two systems, claiming that it is the autocratic regimes and dictatorships that are a threat to peace and liberty around the world. By contrast, experience shows that it is the crisis-prone Western democracies fomenting perpetual warfare around the world while increasingly embracing repression and censorship at home. They have done so not only over the past few decades, but since the birth of democracy more than 2,500 years ago. In the Western world, we have been educated to celebrate and cherish democracy. Yet, if we compare what our democracies deliver with what we're told that they ought to deliver, we must acknowledge that they seem to deliver a lot of what the people dislike, like chronic crises and wars, while all too often failing to deliver what people do desire: peace, prosperity, and security. That implies that at best, our democracies are ineffective at turning people's aspirations into policies. At worst, they impede the democratic process by design. In 2013, Professor Thomas J. Hayes of Trinity University published a study analyzing the voting records of US senators through 5 Congresses, 107th through 111th Congress, and compared these with the public opinion surveys of over 90,000 respondents in the National Annenberg Election Survey. He found that in all of the 5 Congresses examined, the voting record of senators consistently aligned with the opinions of their wealthiest constituents. The opinions of lower income constituents appear to never influence senators' voting behavior. A subsequent study titled "Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens" by Professors Martin Gillens of Princeton University and Benjamin Page of Northwestern University confirmed Hayes' findings. Gillens and Page reviewed nearly 1,800 national surveys on public policy changes between 1981 and 2002. They concluded that, quote, not only do ordinary citizens not have a uniquely substantial power over policy decisions, they have little or no independent influence on policy at all. By contrast, economic elites are estimated to have a quite substantial, highly significant, independent impact on policy, unquote. When, we might ask, do the ordinary people get the policies they favor? As Gillens and Page explained, even where 80% of the public favored some policy change, they only got that change when those policies happened to be preferred by the economic elites. The implication of these studies is that the United States is in fact ruled by an oligarchy concealed behind the facade of democracy. The same is almost certainly true of most other Western democracies. The principle was discernible already since the democracy's birth. In politics, Aristotle explained how under democracy, creditors begin to lend money, demanding payment with interest. In this way, they acquire more and more wealth, turning democracy into an oligarchy. In making itself hereditary, the oligarchy then becomes an aristocracy. In making itself, and just as today's liberal democracies abhor dictators and autocrats, democrats in ancient Greek society abhorred tyrants. Rome equally abhorred kings, establishing the custom of assassinating or exiling any public official at a mere suggestion that they were seeking kingship. Both as a republic and as an empire, Rome was one of history's best examples of unrestrained oligarchic rule. According to historian Michael Grant and other sources, including Cicero, during most times since the overthrow of Rome's last king in 509 BC, 20 or 30 men from a dozen families held what was almost a monopoly of power, with decisive control over financial and foreign affairs. Sallust, himself a lower-ranking senator, complained that a small faction of senators governed Rome, quote, giving and taking always as they please, oppressing the innocent and raising their partisans to honor, while no wickedness, no dishonesty or disgrace is a bar to the attainment of office. Whatever appears desirable, they seize and render their own, and transform their will and pleasure into their law as arbitrarily as victors in a conquered city. Unquote. Below this group of oligarchs was a wealthy officer class, which included the equites or equestrians, a class of knights so designated because their wealth qualified them to serve in the cavalry. Many of them were state contractors, bankers, moneylenders, merchants, tax collectors, and landowners who occupied a social rank just below the aristocrats. One magistrate estimated that the ranks of wealthy families in Rome numbered no more than 2,000. Below them was a mass of impoverished citizens, tenant farmers, and slaves. The effect of the oligarchic rule was similar to what we could observe under all oligarch-denominated democracies through history. They often engender an empire which replicates its own system of governance in colonies they controlled, sowing mayhem throughout the empire with perpetual warfare. But while we know much about Rome's imperial wars, we know much less about the conditions of daily life for the ordinary people in Rome. In The Assassination of Julius Caesar, Michael Parenti conveys some of the imagery from the epoch's chroniclers. The Eternal City downtown featured temples, emporia, public forums, ceremonial sites, and government offices, but the center was surrounded by a dense ring of slums where tens of thousands of working poor lived in squalid conditions. In some places, the lodgings were occupied, piled up 7 or 8 floors high, all lacking toilets, running water, and decent ventilation. Still, the rents for these crumbling quarters were usually more than plebs could afford, forcing multiple families to reside in a single apartment. As Juvenal described it, Rome is supported on pipe stems, matchsticks. It's cheaper thus for the landlord to show up his ruins, patch up the old crack walls. They are expected to sleep secure though the beams are about to crash above them. Cicero himself was a slumlord. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, quote, 2 of my shops have collapsed and the others are showing cracks so that even the mice have moved elsewhere. Others call this a disaster. I don't call it even a nuisance. There's a building scheme underway which will turn this loss into a source of profit, unquote. With rampant poverty came a high crime rate and insecurity. Rome had no street lighting and no police force to speak of. At night, the residents secured their families behind bolted doors. Only the most affluent, who could afford an entourage of servants to light the way and serve as bodyguards, dared to venture outside, and only if necessary. Juvenal wrote that, quote, "It makes no difference whether you try to say something or retreat without a word. They beat you up all the same. You know what the poor man's freedom amounts to? The freedom, after being punched and grounded to pieces and pounded to pieces, to beg and implore that he be allowed to go home with a few teeth left." Rome's frequent social crises led to limited legal reforms intended to redress the economic disparities and curb aristocracy's excesses, but in practice, such laws were routinely circumvented or ignored. Indeed, what we recognize as lawfare in modern parlance was one of Roman oligarchs' key levers to power. Roman courts were staffed exclusively by the patricians and their agents with no checks on their arbitrary judgments. Writing around the turn of the new era, Livy described the secrecy of Rome's legal formula, which were known only to the elite patrician families. These were decisive for any proper legal procedure and were not published, but remained under the well-guarded control of pontifices for another 150 years. In all, Rome's oligarchic system of governance favored a steady and inexorable upward transfer of wealth from the disenfranchised multitudes and colonial subjects to her parasitic oligarchy. As a consequence, Roman internal politics were marked by almost perpetual social and political unrest, exacerbated by an overhang of unpayable debts, rolling civil wars, frequent colonial uprisings, and periodic slave revolts. From the late 2nd century before Christ, a long succession of public officials, many of them of aristocratic birth themselves, understood that Rome was on the road to perdition and attempted to institute more far-reaching reforms. Among them were brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, Lucius Apuleius, Saturnius, Gaius Servilius Gallucia, Marcus Livius Drusus, Sulpicius Rufus, Lucius Sergius Catiline, Gaius Marius, who was Julius Caesar's uncle by marriage, Cnaeus Sinicius, Quintus Sertorius, Gaius Manilius, and Julius Caesar himself. With few exceptions, they were all hunted down and killed by senatorial elites' death squads, along with thousands of their supporters. The assassination of Julius Caesar on 15th March 44 BC put the last nail in the coffin of social reforms in Rome. The oligarchy ruled unrestrained, multiplying wars abroad and crushing all opponents at home through harsh repression and terror. This system of governance ultimately devastated Rome's economy at the same time as the cost of maintaining the empire spiraled out of control. With her treasury depleted and too little left to take from the colonies and the working poor, the oligarchy turned their sights at Rome's wealthy citizens. In the first half of the 3rd century AD, Emperor Maximinus was short of funds he needed to pay his troops. Fearing that his troops might kill him if he failed to pay their wages, Maximinus started expropriating Rome's distinguished families. Apparently, however, what he was able to confiscate from them fell short, and his troops did in fact kill him in 238 AD. The chronic shortage of funds led to overall decline in law and order, and gangs of renegade pirates increasingly roamed the countrysides, attacking towns and villages to pillage and plunder. Destitute freedmen and runaway slaves often joined these gangs as an alternative to serfdom. Herodian described the fear that gripped the elites themselves. Quote, "Although no fighting was going on and no enemy was under arms anywhere, Rome appeared to be a city under siege." Many Roman citizens sought salvation by emigrating to territories controlled by the barbarians. Writing around 440 AD, Salvian captured the plight of peasants struggling under the burden of unbearable taxation, abandoning their lands to break free from the terror of tax farmers and moneylenders. Quote, "They migrate either to the Goths or to the Bacudae, or to other barbarians everywhere in power. They do not regret having migrated. They prefer to live as free men under an outward form of captivity than as captives under an appearance of liberty." However, not all could afford to emigrate. Those who couldn't surrender their land and their liberty to patrician landowners in return for protection. As Salvian chronicled it, the process turned free men into slave en masse. By the late 6th and 7th centuries, the devastation of Western Roman Empire was almost total. Houses began to vanish from the archaeological footprint. Dirt floors became the norm, and the technique of building in mortar, stone, and brick was lost. Many basic crafts like wheel pottery disappeared for a few centuries. The market for low-value functional goods and solid quality common usage items collapsed. Without markets, coinage also disappeared, and during the final stages, the Western Empire's economy operated on barter. As a result of the breakdown of public administration and funding for public works, monumental structures began to turn to ruin. Previously thriving cities emptied out, population levels cratered, and Rome itself became a desolate with shepherds tending their flocks among its crumbling relics. In modern times, the full symptoms of the pathogenic rule by oligarchies were exemplified in Russia during the 1990s. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia began its transition from a communist dictatorship to a Western-style democracy. But behind the facade of democracy, the real power was usurped by a small group of oligarchs, most powerful of whom was the Sembankirshchina, the gang of 7 bankers, all of whom were trustees of Western financial interests. The seven were Boris Berezovsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Mikhail Friedman, Vladimir Vinogradov, Vladimir Gusinsky, Vladimir Potanin, and Alexander Smolensky. Behind the facade of democracy and her elected president, Boris Yeltsin, the group dominated Russia. Boris Berezovsky, whom in 1997, US News and World Report called, quote,
Does anyone else not hear Alex anymore?
Yeah, he froze.
He froze.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. It's not just on my side. Okay, so what we can do, here, let me just go back to, I'm assuming that he's getting it figured out right now on his end. Ed, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay. I could just simply
Yes, switch to com. Yeah. Check if com is here. Let com jump in.
Okay, com did arrive. Hey,
I
there,
am here.
there you are, com.
Yes,
Okay.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm happy that you made it. I wasn't sure if you were going to be able to come on today. So unfortunately,
I joined 5 minutes after the beginning. So
oh, fantastic! That's excellent. Okay, well, in that case, thank God we have a spare speaker here. So Com is going to pick up, maybe not from ancient Rome, but definitely we should have this deep history in our minds. I mean, I think about the collapse of Rome more than I ever thought I would in my life. I think a lot of people do these days. So I'm happy that Alex took a step back and took sort of a God's eye view at the world situation with a lot of parallels that we're currently going through that I think people could recognize within the late stage of Roman Empire collapse, with a look towards maybe what could have been done by people who would have operated without folly animating their worldview and assumptions, which resulted in dark age and devastation and war over a millennia ago. So we're in there's a lot of parallels, except Rome didn't have nuclear warheads peppered all over the world, nor did it have 8 billion people. And they say the higher you are, the harder you fall. So that's an additional existential threat we're currently facing as a modern civilization is concerned. But also we have, with that technology, greater opportunities to do great good as well. That was unconceivable in previous generations. So with that, Com, I leave it for you. Thank you.
thank you. Good evening to all. I hope you can hear me clearly. I am in New Delhi, and it's more than 9 p.m. here. I was listening very carefully to the 2 previous speakers. I must also say I'm very thankful to Edward Lozensky for inviting me to participate in this online forum. And I was able to, of course, appreciate once more from Dr. Krainer the parallels that we can draw between Roman history and sorry, I have to, yeah, because there is always that question about the language, so there must have been an interruption. But anyway, there is certainly a lot of parallels between dying Rome and the dying global empire that is primarily originally a Western Atlantic empire, and in the last 100 years or so, an American-dominated empire. And I believe that it's a biological process we're witnessing, because we find that we can say the same thing about so many other empires. And we see the parallels, whether in the East or in the West, you get into that stage of decay after the stage of reaching a pinnacle of power, which is often equated with greatness. And it can be in terms of cultural and intellectual flourishing. But we know that eventually the price has to be paid. Karma does not let us go free. And therefore, eventually, countries like people pay for their excesses and their follies. So in this regard, I would like to say that Ed, when he invited me to speak, had asked me to refer to the latest article by Secretary of State, the current Secretary of State of the United States, Antony Blinken, in Foreign Affairs, which is known for publishing screeds of American triumphalism, or at least very, apologetic presentations of America's case. And Blinken says a number of things that do not surprise any of us, because he refers to very well-known current events, and he tries to justify the actions of the Biden administration, and also tries to see what America wants to achieve, and why America cannot change its objectives, because they are the only ones that can preserve, as he puts it, global freedom, prosperity, democracy, all the good things that the previous speakers was referring to. So here we know that there is obviously worry. There is an attempt to dispel worries from other countries and even from Americans, because Blinken tells us that America is taking all the decisions, all the right decisions under the Biden administration to restore America's primacy, the United States primacy, and to keep the flock behind the US in order, and to make sure that so-called revisionist countries are not allowed to get their say. And when he calls them revisionist, he, of course, designates China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and a few others. And clearly what he means by revisionist is countries that do not accept the status quo, which in his official language is the only possible alternative. There is no alternative. And of course, he takes the opportunity of castigating the Trump administration and Trump's policies for endangering that wonderful edifice which Biden has tried to restore and strengthen. Now, that tells us clearly that US feels, the US elites that we were referring to lately as being like the Roman elites, they are very concerned that if the system is deeply modified, then they will lose their preponderance, and they feel this is practically counternatural, because nature endows liberal democracies with natural superiority, and therefore any alternative means a return to some form of barbarity. And this is what has been often alluded to by the Ukrainian leaders, in particular Zelensky, as well as by EU top bureaucrats and by American leaders, that Europe and America are defending universal values when faced with the barbarity of authoritarian or autocratic regimes, whose main crime is not to accept the order of things dictated and set by the US and their allies. And this is very open and public. So we are not putting words into their mouth. We are simply reflecting the situation. And of course, when we have this debate in almost any part of the world, we will find many people telling us about how many wrong things are happening in the countries that are opposing the current system. So naturally, you will have plenty of people saying, well, I don't like what is happening under the American, European waning hegemony, but it is still better, or at least it's not worse than what is happening in China and what's happening in Russia, not to mention other countries. So there are obviously all sorts of pros and cons. And one cannot say that all good is on one side and all evil is on the other, even though Americans make that claim all the time when they say that, however, many problems they may have, they are still basically the party of good. And anybody who opposes them is not with them and therefore is the party of evil. So that leads me to the situation with Ukraine and the related war in the Near East, in West Asia, because we can see that in both cases, we have with Ukraine the very clear resolve from the West to make sure that the status quo is not disrupted. And that's the discourse you hear. I could quote the former foreign minister of Europe, if you want to call him that way, Mr. Borrell, or I could call Blinken, or I could quote a number of other leaders, explaining to you that it's not so much the matter of Ukrainians in this war. It's a matter of protecting the international order and making sure that borders are not violated or changed, and that territorial integrity is preserved. Obviously, that is a very hypocritical way of presenting it, because we all know that when a country is not friendly or to the West or part of the West, then these issues are not considered such a major problem. And we have had recently, not too far into the past, we have had the situation of Yugoslavia, which was broken up with full Western participation under the Western leadership, and Kosovo, which was also split from Serbia on the grounds that it deserved to be independent, even though Kosovo was, as we know, a mix of Serbs and Albanians, with almost a very slim majority of Albanians. Anyway, that shows us that these issues are only considered in terms of political alignments, and that in the case of Ukraine, the idea of creating a sort of an anti-Russia, which would be completely although Slavic and Orthodox, would be completely pro-Western, pro-American, and part of the EU and NATO, was seen as a major achievement. And the West was willing to invest a lot of capital in every sense to make that happen, even knowing that Russia would certainly oppose it. They may have been misled about how resolute Russia would be on that issue. They thought that probably Russia would just have no choice but to accept the new status quo. But as a matter of fact, when they saw that they had to fight the Russians, then they closed the door on any kind of negotiation or compromise and decided to fight as long as they say, as there were Ukrainians alive to fight. And this is the situation we're in now. Although everybody knows that this war is running to its inevitable end, simply because Ukraine is no longer in a position to effectively fight. It will not recover the 20% territory it has lost. And Europe and even the US have lost the ability and the resolve to invest enough means to actually defeat Russia, which would probably not only involve direct NATO participation, but possibly recourse to nuclear weapons. And we all know that the US is never excluding the possibility of using nuclear weapons, which in turn has led Russia to threaten that under certain conditions it might be compelled to use nuclear weapons. And so we have come to an impasse. We have come to a dead end because nobody knows how to get out of this. And the fear on both sides is that even if there is some sort of a ceasefire, which the US for a while has obviously been hoping for, this would lead to a frozen conflict that would technically enable the Ukrainians to keep fighting in an asymmetric manner, to keep weakening and undermining Russia's inner stability. And this is clearly what is happening now, because even though Ukraine can no longer line up enough soldiers for a full-fledged war, it can still launch drones and use terrorist tactics in which there is now a great deal of expertise in Ukraine, because thousands of people have been trained for that, and not only Ukrainians, but people from other side. I must say that having some friends who are connected to Ukraine and in some cases are Ukrainians, I hear them say that they actually dislike or even hate Zelensky and his regime. They feel no attachment to the cause of an independent NATO member, Ukraine, and they feel they have been cheated and used as cannon fodder by Western interests, which have clearly taken up Zelensky as a tool, as a cat's paw, to achieve certain strategic goals. And this is, I believe, more widespread than one thinks in Ukrainian society, even now. So otherwise, even after all that happened and all the many people who have died and a lot of the infrastructure that has been destroyed, most Ukrainians do not really hold hostile feelings towards Russians because they feel and know that they are part of the same people and that, in fact, they are much closer to Russians, even after all this fratricidal war, which is in a way a civil war. They are still closer to the Russians than they are to the Americans or the Germans. However, of course, we have to take into account a minority of people who have been fanatically groomed to be anti-Russian, primarily because they have inherited the legacy of the Banderist ideology, which glorifies Ukraine's past as being at its most, I would say, deserving, and when it was fighting under Hitler's flags to crush the Bolsheviks. So the combination of anti-communist ideology and anti-Russian ideology, which the Americans have exploited very well in Ukraine, and the British too, this has led to the current situation we see. So where does that leave us? Well, considering that inevitably, as it was sort of predicted, there is now a widening war which extends to West Asia, but it's beginning also to penetrate again the Caucasus, and Iran is on the front line. And we have seen that Israel seems to be planning a major attack on Iran's vital infrastructure. And from what we have seen of the Russian reaction, it appears that President Putin has stepped in as a mediator. He's the only one who has received Netanyahu in the last few days in a secret visit, where probably some discussion was held about what is the next step. I seem to be stepping away here from the Ukraine theater, but in fact, the two theaters are very closely connected. And I believe that's why Russia has now become a vital factor in the war, which after being a war between Israel and, you might call it that way, and Hamas, has now become a war between Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and also the Houthis, and guerrillas in Syria and in Iraq. Now it is turning into a direct war between Israel and Iran. And the Russians seem to have made it clear that there has to be some agreement that limits that conflict and enables the two main, I would say, contenders, Iran and Israel, to stop their direct confrontation. But if that doesn't happen and Israel launches a very nevralgic attack to try to disrupt and break down Iran's society and political status quo, then the Russians might intervene to prevent Israel from gaining a decisive advantage. So that leaves us, of course, in the situation where both in Ukraine and in the Near East, the West is being challenged and could possibly be beaten because it appears to be going towards defeat. And by defeat, we mean defeat in Ukraine, but also defeat of Israel. The third theater, of course, for which the Americans are actively preparing is the South China Sea and Taiwan, which is seen as the next stage of the confrontation between East and West, between what might be seen as the BRICS bloc now and the Western bloc. And precisely in that very paper written by Blinken, he says that NATO is now considering its role in the South China Sea and in the Western Pacific. And that, of course, implies the American intention of involving not only the members of NATO, but also the American allies or client states such as Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and possibly some others, Thailand, and even, of course, India through the mechanism of the Quad. So although India is definitely not in favor of this. So we see that we are entering a stage in which there is a global confrontation. And that would be probably the face of the New World War, because it would take into account the various critical factors at play, such as naturally the sea routes and the vital energy and mineral resources. So I think we probably are again at a situation where, despite all the attempts and all the talk about avoiding war, we may not be able to avoid it, simply because we may be able to delay it. But I think there are times when the system breaks down, war is an almost inevitable outcome. And that is what we have to be prepared for. As much as we would like to be positive, we are dealing with very harsh realities. And I know that it's very hard to take sides, because in many cases, people are not convinced about what would be the right way to handle this, and whether one side would be better than the other. This happens even in domestic politics. If you look at the upcoming elections in the US, what I have noticed is, of course, the deep, everybody knows about the deep division between the Trump supporters and people who are holding on for what they consider to be the necessary alternative to Trump, because they feel Trump is a deeply unstable and divisive and destructive individual, and his policies are regarded as highly unfair and pro-capitalist. And of course, there is also the element of economic warfare in Trump's program. So there are no clear, easy choices. But if you hear somebody whom I feel is now talking a lot of sense in many ways, even though he may not be the most obvious candidate for that, is Elon Musk. And what he says about how we see America going, whether it goes with Trump or whether it stays with the Democrats, Kamala Harris, who, by the way, has never been elected by anybody and who has been imposed upon the American political system, very much in line with what was said about democracy by Mr. Krainer. We see that we have no guarantee that Trump will actually work for peace. He might try in some cases, especially in Ukraine, but will he be able to overcome the system, both national and international? And would he be able then to do what he wants? And does he even want it if he's put under pressure by certain forces? So there is no clear remedy to what's happening in the political scene, because all candidates or would-be personalities, would-be leaders who offer an alternative are simply not in a position to reach power in the foreseeable future. Therefore, we are still, no matter what we do, in the hands of the oligarchy, as was said before. And that's where I would like to end. I hope I have covered a little bit where we are and what the American position is. And of course, the most worrisome aspect of the American official policy is its complete rejection of compromise. If Trump could make some compromises, which many of his supporters believe he would, because of people who are with him like Tulsi Gabbard and Robert Kennedy and others, then we might see indeed an improvement, if only for self-interest, in order to try to repair the American economy, which has become a disaster, just as the political system and the social fabric are being torn apart. And that is perhaps the reason why there is probably a motive to hope for a Trump victory. But I am also skeptical about that. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Com. Okay, well, that was a good thumbnail sketch of the world situation. I think there was a very cogent, sober analysis. And I think it opens the door for some good dialogue with the audience, which is really what Ed Lazansky had in mind, I think, when we were discussing what we're going to do with this. We want to encourage people to learn how to flex that muscle of having dialogues based on reason, which is not happening nearly enough, and really a commitment to solving big problems, existential problems. So there's already a few names who got in early, so there's a little bit of a queue forming, a line forming. So I encourage people to add your line there, your name into the chat box, and we'll call upon you in queue. Before I go to the first question, Ed, any comments or any from your end? Oh, you're on mute. You gotta unmute. Nope. Yeah, you gotta unmute. Ed, yeah. Sorry.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. No, well, it's okay. Let's go with Q&A because I think we had three great historical and current situation analyzed. Not very optimistic, but maybe we should add some optimism. And one of the I think point which I want to make is that suddenly just news came today. I hope that this is correct, that UN Secretary General is coming to Russia to take part in this BRICS meeting. This will be really important because we criticize the United Nations and General Secretary that they basically this UN now has no leverage, and by he's making a point in all this atmosphere of hatred, he's going to Russia and take part, maybe say something at the BRICS meeting. I think it's very encouraging. So I don't have too many other optimistic news, but maybe some of the speakers who have it. So let's go ahead with Q&A.
Yeah. Well, hopefully certain individuals within the West with some influence are learning how to eat some humble pie and reevaluate their axioms. So we'll see about that. The first name that I saw get in there was Jack Keenan, and then we have Tony Pappert. Jack, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I had two questions. I think you were more interested in the second. Assuming that a multipolar world emerges, and Mackinder's thesis about Eurasia dominance, I'm wondering if Russia and China are likely to remain aligned long term, or will their separate national interests cause them to become rivals down the road? So is the BRICS alliance sustainable in the view of the experts here? My other question is, what's the future role of the United States? Will we, in a multipolar world, will the United States become like a trading state, like Venice was in the earlier, and maybe dominating in the northern hemisphere or the Americas? So the future of Russia and China alliance and the role of the United States are my questions.
Okay, so we got Alex has popped back into the digital room, by the way, as well. So Alex, do you want to tackle that before Com does, or are you still there, Alex? Yeah, you're on mute, by the way. If anybody showed up, you're by default on mute.
Sorry, I apologize. I had a call from WhatsApp coming in, so I lost sound for about 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. So you couldn't hear the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, essentially the question was in pertaining in relation
About inflation?
No, not inflation so much. It was more in regards to the future, the danger of the cohesiveness. The questioner was asking a two-part question. One, the cohesiveness of the Russia-China alliance within the multipolar alliance, and could there be any danger of I suppose self-interest, sort of the ignorant form of nationalism that we've seen cause problems in the past between the Sino-Russia split, is how I was thinking about his question. Could that be another danger again? And the other one was the role of the United States within a broader multipolar alliance, and he made a reference to Venice and the Netherlands. But so I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
Okay, so I think that the Sino-Russian alliance is for the long term, and I think that it will last at the very least until they have defeated the Western Empire comprehensively. And the reason for that is because if by any chance Western Empire managed to regime change Russia and to put in power somebody like Boris Yeltsin or Alexei Navalny, that type of a person, their own servant, they would proceed to use Russia as a bludgeon with which to attack China in the exact same way in which they have used Ukraine as a bludgeon to attack Russia. And Russia's military now is so powerful and their weaponry is so advanced that this could be effective. So China's commitment to their alliance with Russia is not merely a transitory interest. It's very much strategic in nature, and it will continue. And they have, if you're in Russia, you don't have to go far to find xenophobic sentiment. If the Western interests took charge in Russia, it probably wouldn't take very much to start fomenting the same kind of hysteria as they have done in Ukraine against Russia, to start, taking over the media and then start creating a xenophobic hysteria and start to turn Russian people against the Chinese people, and little by little to impose a war on China in the same way that they have done against Ukraine against Russia with Ukraine. So this alliance will continue to be the main axis of the BRICS movement, and I think that the BRICS movement will continue to grow because there are more and more countries that have much to gain in numbers to resist the pressures and coercive policies of the empire, and to find benefit in mutual trade and build their own prosperity in that way. The United States, I think, will ultimately have to join this movement as one of the nations that trades on let's call it a fair and equitable basis with everybody else. And I think that in this sense, the United States has a lot to offer. The only people who are going to be losing out are the banking cartel, because for them the overarching concern is that they have control of the resources, which they then turn into their collateral, which they then use to float loans to corporations that are their client, and through that mechanism ensure that all the wealth produced by all these nations ultimately accrues to them, that they are the ones who are at the receiving end of most of the wealth creation from this system. In terms of mutually beneficial trade, everybody else is a winner. The American economy remains the most, the most dynamic economy in the world, with the most vibrant entrepreneurial culture, with much to offer, much to export, and a lot to trade. And with the Chinese strategy of lifting people out of poverty to create a population of several billion affluent consumers, there's going to be a lot to win, because for the past few centuries, the Western strategy has been exactly the opposite. It has been deliberately to keep the global South in poverty so that their own domestic economies wouldn't compete for the resources that they export, so that they would be exported dirt cheap. And so Chinese strategy is completely different. Chinese approach will create probably 3 or 4 billion affluent consumers everywhere around the world. And I think that the United States economy will find a great deal of interest in joining this project, rather than policing the old world order, the system of governance that is now being dominated by the Western financial cartel.
Okay, thank you, Alex. We have a long list, a surprisingly long list of people waiting to ask questions. So we're gonna move on. I'm sorry, Koma. Actually, I should honestly offer you a chance to give your 2 cents if you'd like. Koma, you're on mute, by the way.
I think that the Russian-Chinese alliance is not really an alliance, but it's a compact based on mutual interest and practically a protection from possible destruction. So there is not much of a choice they have that way. And I have noticed, for example, living in India, how now, also with Russia's support, India and China, which have had a very difficult relationship, are gradually and slowly mending fences, which is making Americans very angry. And that shows that even countries that do not share much sympathy and which distrust each other's motives are able to build mutually beneficial economic relations. With regard to American trade and economic potential and current health, I would, however, caution the fact that America is under such an extraordinarily high burden of debt that it will probably have to economically collapse before it can rebuild itself. And essentially, it has become a hostage to the moneylenders. And we can see the results of that. The banks in America have 7 times more exposure, more serviced, I mean, the debt that cannot be repaid than they had in 2008. And yet they are spending hundreds of billions and trillions, in fact, that they don't have. So this is basically money that one day is going to bring the country down, and everybody knows it. Getting out of the dollar is not out of a noble motive to sort of overcome a particularly hated country, but it is simply a matter of survival for other countries if they don't want to be sunk by the American, disaster that's coming.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Tony, who has a question comment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to be brief. I mean, Alex Krainer's, if only he had finished. I mean, I second the comment that asked him to make available to us the whole of what he intended to present. I think he ended in a very illuminating discussion of the Roman Empire. And his reference just now to the banking elite was very apt. I mean, there is no American empire. There is no West in the term which people have been using in this discussion, or many people. I mean, there's the enemy within, to use a phrase of President Trump, which has gotten a lot of currency. There's the serpent at our breast. There's a transnational financier oligarchical faction, which is dedicated at this moment to an end-time program to uproot and destroy the nation-state republic everywhere, equally in Western Europe and in the US. I mean, why are the aspects of destruction of Western Europe echoed identically in the United States, like the mass immigration, which is destroying Europe, destroying the US at the same time? I mean, we don't have an American empire, as I say. We have a financier oligarchical faction which traces its own origin to exactly the Roman oligarchy, which Alex was talking about, which aims to destroy the US and the nations of Western Europe. It's shutting down industry in the US and Western Europe, mass immigration. It's plunged the United States into destructive, completely useless wars since Korea, Vietnam, the Mideast, all these wars with the intention of destroying us, putting us into a war confrontation with Russia, with the intention of destroying both. I mean, this is not America. This is a faction which is desperately concerned to achieve the election of so-called, Kamala Harris in 2 weeks.
Hey, Tony, I'm so sorry, Tony. Do you want to just round that out?
I mean, I would just end by repeating. I mean, Elon Musk has been mentioned. He's holding a meeting every night in Pennsylvania, and at those meetings, he says, in this election, we face not only the question of the survival of the United States, but Western civilization. And I think that's true for the reason I said. There's an enemy within who is out to destroy, if you like, Western civilization, and not over the long term.
Right. Thank you, Tony. Anybody want to comment on that? And it's true. It's a frustration I often share too. People often use the language that presumes that there's this naturally organic thing of empires that emerge out of nation states organically, which we wouldn't have if we just had some sort of a post-national world regime. But they ignore the whole discussion of the continuity of oligarchism as a function of that which shapes world history for thousands of years. They just ignore it. So I do appreciate what you just said as far as coloring this conversation with more nuance. Alex Combe, would you guys like to comment?
Well, I'm of course. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Com.
Thank you. Well, no, I certainly would support. That's why I mentioned Musk, because I believe he's making some very good points, just as in another area, Tulsi Gabbard is, and also Tucker Carlson and others. So inevitably, people are becoming aware of the problem. And I agree that the rot is from inside, and foreign enemies are invoked and promoted in order to try to bring the forces of the ruling forces of the country together to fight an enemy. So creating an enemy, as we know, is a condition to the perpetuation of empires. And the US has been very good at that. So yes, absolutely no disagreement with that. I understand that Trump may not be a factor of peace in every respect because he has promised to wage a merciless economic war on all countries that join BRICS and get away from the dollar. He said he would impose 100% tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. We don't know how much of that is rhetoric, how much of it is feasible, but clearly he will not go down quietly as far as primacy of the US in the financial and economic sphere.
Thank you. Alex, you want to chime in?
Yeah, just a quick reply to Tony's comments. I regret that I got cut off because my presentation was based basically on kind of putting into perspective the conflict between the two systems of governance, one which is supposedly democracy and one which is supposedly dictatorships and tyrannies. Because what actually happens is that in democracies, the money lending power is dominant and it's driving policy internally and externally, whereas in these so-called dictatorships like in Russia, you have the sovereign who is above the oligarchy, and so the sovereign can put the oligarchs in their pen, in their playbox, set the rules and say, you play here, this is your role, this is what you're allowed to do, no more. Whereas in democracies, including Rome as a republic, the oligarchs had an unrestricted rule. In Russia, the oligarchs had unrestricted rule until Vladimir Putin took over. So the group of 7 bankers practically ran Russia as their own private fiefdom. And in the 10 years that they have done so, they have completely destroyed Russia. And one of the first things that Vladimir Putin did when he came to power is he lined up the oligarchs and he told them, these are the rules of the game. One, run your companies and keep your wealth, but pay your taxes correctly, treat your employees as human beings, not as a disposable resource. And 3, and most importantly, stay out of politics. And so after a few years of back and forth where he had to put one of them in prison, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the oligarchs were obliged to make peace with the new set of rules. And they kept their wealth. They're still billionaires. They're still oligarchs, but they no longer have political influence. Vladimir Putin is above them. And Russia has taken off as a nation, as a power, as an economy, and as a civilization as a result. Vladimir Putin took Russia out of the gutter by simply putting the oligarchs into their playpen and saying, these are the rules under which you are allowed to operate. So this is the contrast. Whereas we in the West, we have this democracies where oligarchy is above the political system. It is unimaginable that Keir Starmer or Donald Trump or any of these prime ministers of presidents can line up the oligarchs and set the rules. That's that.
Thank you.